And the Hangout on air is live. Isn't technology wonderful?
Love it.
Thank you very much for joining me, Mike. This should be an interesting conversation.
Yes, absolutely. As they all are when we get together.
That's right. I'm sure Irakli will join us in no time at all, but let me just clarify for anybody who wants to watch this why I sort of asked to have this conversation. You have been one of the opponents leading the charge on bringing profiles to the mainstream of the hypermedia world. And I remember back in ResFest, we did some experiments with profiles, and there were some interesting ideas there, and it was a very valuable experience. But from my perspective, I've been playing a lot more with media types that have more of a horizontal focus and actually have the application semantics built right into them. And I'm still trying to convince myself of the value of making this distinction between profiles containing the application semantics and the media types having the protocol and message and structural semantics. So I have a bunch of questions, and who better to answer those questions is yourself. And also, Irakli's not here, but he made the comment that he doesn't think people should be creating more media types, so I figure I have to at least challenge him on that question.
Well, hopefully he'll come and defend himself on that one.
Yeah. I think probably the best thing to do right off the bat is just to give a definition of what a media type is, what a profile is, real quick, just so that we're all on the same page with that. So I'll give you what I consider a media type to be, and you can tell me what you consider a profile to be. How does that sound?
That sounds great. I love it. I love it.
Okay. So a media type to me is a contract. It tends to be a contract written in human English prose, and it describes all of the rules of the message that goes over the wire. And it contains everything about that message that goes in the wire, all of the semantics of that message. And media types are generally encouraged to be registered with IANA and go through a little bit of review just to make sure that you're not doing something silly that people have learned was silly years ago. So it goes through a bit of an expert review. And although that is not essential, it is a recommended practice. And the other advantage of once you have a media type registered with IANA, it becomes available in a public place. So if you have a public API and you're sharing a message that is identified with a particular media type, the recipient of it knows where to go and look up and find that written specification. So that kind of summarizes in my head what a media type is. It's a contract. Does that work for you?
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I don't have too much argument with that at all. So just to kind of jump into the profile thing, I would say at the outset there are actually sort of a couple of angles on the idea of a profile. So, there's sort of the technical version of the story, there's the conceptual version of the story, and there's sort of the abstract version of the story. And, from the abstract point of view, if you just look up the definition, the profile comes from an Italian word that has to do with, like, drawing out a thread or spinning out a thread, file, filum, stuff like this. And really, the most common noun definitions are like a profile of a person's face, like a drawing, like a very brief, indicator. And then the other one is sort of a descriptive, like, somebody wrote his, profile. It's like a bio. It's like a profile of a person, right? There was a book by Kennedy called Profiles in Courage. It was really sort of a description or a sort of a brief outline of someone. So I think when you think about those ideas, that's kind of the conceptual idea that I and Leonard Richardson sort of approach when we talked about profiles in the last book, the Web APIs book, the notion that there's a sort of a description, a brief outline or a brief description of something, and that was really what was meant by that idea of profile. And there are a couple of flavors of that. Leonard and I are promoting this idea of the application level profile semantics. The one that you actually helped us experiment with, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago? It was a while ago, right?
2 years ago, I think.
The very first one, yeah. So that's really sort of meant to be a sort of a brief description of something. And that's really that sort of rests on a historical thing which used to be in HTML. There was actually a profile attribute on the HTML element and on the head element. It actually sort of described briefly what was going on inside this document. And there's a guy by the name of Semantic Gap who had created a format to express what was in a profile. And I'm going to get this wrong. It's XDMP or XMDP. Someone could look it up and straighten it out for me. But it's sort of an XHTML media type profile or media profile definition or something like that. And I can't quite remember. So he had been doing this like several years ago. I want to say is in the aughts era, right? Maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, something like that. And that sort of took off. There were several people to do this. The DCMI, the Dublin Core Group, finished their profile spec in 2009. And there are a handful of other things that are sort of profile-like that kind of went through that period. Well, HTML5 dumped the profile. And Eric Wild actually completed an RFC spec to make profile a standalone item. I don't remember the RFC number. I think it's actually just called profiles. And Eric's, what's that? I don't remember. But the idea is he sort of elevated it outside a particular media type. Profiles were just HTML only. So now we have profiles. Profiles can be used as link headers. They can be incorporated into other media type designs and stuff like that. So that's sort of the arc of the pattern. The idea that it's a brief description. It's actually started in HTML quite a long time ago, was dropped, has now been set as a standalone item. And there have been some people who've been working up ways to start describing what a profile contains. The profile RFC doesn't talk about what it contains or what a format is. It just says, you know, how you use it to indicate the profile of this particular message or something like that. So so that's sort of the story. And behind it is the notion that a profile describes or offers a brief description about what's here or about what this is about. And that sort of leads, I think, to the heart of what we want to talk about today. What you and I have talked about before is, why is it we are talking about an additional way to describe what's in this message, right? Which I think is sort of going right at the heart of it. You talked about this in a couple of places in the blog post that you recently posted, and we've talked about this before. But I think that's kind of the nut of it. Leonard and I talk about this notion that the message doesn't necessarily contain all the information you need in order to be able to operate on it, and that this idea of a profile sort of bridges a gap between the message and what's actually in it. And I think that's where you and I have talked before about the idea that, well, maybe it ought to be in the message and you shouldn't have to rely on an external source, right? I think that's right. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think that's kind of
no, that pretty much summarizes my concern.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's sort of the way I think about profiles. I mentioned ALPS. I'll mention Hydra, too. Hydra is a flavor of JSON-LD that was designed by Marcus Lanathaler. Marcus is, I would call him, one of the leading lights in this RDF space. Marcus has done a great deal to bridge, talk about, gaps. Talked a lot about bridging common JSON with RDF and the semantic web ideas. I think he and the group that have edited and created JSON-LD have done a fantastic job in doing that. And one of the designs based on JSON-LD is this thing called Hydra, which is also very descriptive or profile-like. It's a little bit different than the way we approach ALPS, but I think it's another thing that's actually getting traction as well.
Well, that sort of leads into one of my questions in that, like, Hydra, I think, is referred to as a vocabulary.
Right.
People use another term, they use ontology in the RDF world, right? And if you look at how people layer semantics onto XML documents, like in the Atom world, you had like OData and GData that use namespaces to add on to existing media types. How do you see profiles as being different than ontologies and namespaces?
I don't see them being fundamentally different, but I do see them being different in quality, at least the profiles as Leonard and I attempted them. So if you talk about, if you look at the RDF ontologies, you look at activity streams, which is another kind of, you know, ontology or vocabulary pattern, right? You mentioned that in your blog post as well. One of the things that I think is missing is an explicit way to talk about action. Most of these are talking about nouns, like things, and they're not talking about how you can do a transition or how you can go from A to B. That usually ends up in physical documentation. Even if you go back to DCMI's profile system from 2009, they have a very elaborate way of using Dublin core values to describe a set of objects and relationships between the objects. And then they go right on to say, in order to know how to operate on this model, you need to read human documentation, right? So one of the things that Leonard and I focus on is what's missing in many of these is a machine description for action, a machine description for transition. And that's a thing that Leonard and I focused a lot on in ALPS. So we tend to say ALPS is vocabulary plus action or property plus action. But I will say that activity streams is one of the things that's changed. I think you mentioned in your blog post how going back on it, it looked rather different than it did a couple of years ago. One of the things that's changed is I think they're starting to do a better job of creating a general action model rather than a specific one. And I think that might make it a little bit more valuable. But I haven't really kept up with James' work over the last 6 months or so.
Yeah. Let me throw a spanner in this works insofar as this effort to describe actions. One of the things that I sort of see what REST does and is it says, okay, we're going to use this uniform interface. We're going to use a predefined set of verbs. In the case of HTTP, get, put, post, that have well-defined semantics. Mm-hmm. But those are a very, very limited set of verbs, right?
Yeah, that's actually the goal, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right? We're minimizing the set of verbs, methods, to be able to get this more interoperable type of system. And the way we get around that and get the necessary amount of expressivity that we need is by creating new resources. All right, so the classic example for me is, well, I don't need a print method because I can have a resource that's a print queue, and I can add a document to the print queue resource, and there are standard semantics in HTTP for adding a thing as a subordinate of a resource. I can post my document to the print queue, and it's just a different way of saying the same thing but using less actions and more nouns. So my argument is do we really need to start describing actions in hypermedia types? Because if we do that, aren't we just sort of defeating the point of the uniform interface?
Well, there's a lot of things going on in what you said. You clearly are describing actions. Right? Yes. You actually translated the act of adding something to a print queue into a protocol.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
You actually translated the notion of adding to a print queue into an HTTP post, if I paid attention to the story. Right?
Yep. Yep.
So, how do you
we need another way? If I can already do that.
No. I know of no other way. That's not the point. So my question is, how would you describe that in a machine-readable form? You know, we just did it in a couple of sentences. How would you do it in a machine-readable form?
Well, my immediate reaction would be, well, there's two answers to that question. Is one, I don't have to, because
if a machine's going to do it, you have to.
Well, if I already know I'm using HTTP, right? I already know that one of my options is to be able to post to a resource. So then the only thing left to do is to provide a link relation that tells me that's a print queue,
No, that's not the
And
only thing left to do. There's actually many things, right? So one of the ways I could describe it in a machine-readable form is to write code, right? I take the sentences that I read,
yeah,
and I
okay.
turn it into source code, right?
Okay. Yep.
I actually say, I create a function called add to print queue, and that function uses an HTTP call to some address, passing some arguments, and that adds something to a print queue. That's one way to do it, right?
Yep.
Another way to do it would be to just use like hypermedia control, like an HTML post form, right? I actually create a form, right? And it's got the address on it, and it's got the arguments, and maybe it's even filled in. And then I put a class on it that says add to print queue, right? That actually contains all the information that's in the sentence, right?
No, see, I would argue there you still have to write the code to interpret that form and actually execute all you're doing is raising the level of abstraction of the interaction to a meta description of how to make the HTML request, rather than it being rather than the client saying, "Oh, I know I need to post to this print queue." You're now allowing the server to provide instructions to the client and say, "This is a form that requires a post." So the client now says, "Well, okay, I have to post to this form." To me, there's not a significant difference between those two options, other than the fact that you allow potentially in the future the server to change the post to a get.
Wow. Okay. So the server couldn't change the address?
Well, yeah, but the server can change the address if I use a link relation too, right?
Yeah, but
there's a link to the print queue, so I can change.
You understand that? I mean, there are lots of ways to accomplish the same thing. I mean, do you want to say that there's only one way?
No.
Okay.
No.
So when I mention more than one, do you want to say they're just the same?
No, they're you're right. They are different. Agreed.
Right?
Yes.
There's lots of possibilities.
Yes,
I could even design. I got through two, right? I could even design, a domain-specific message model that doesn't use HTML forms. Actually has like a tag that says add to print queue.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
That's another way I could start to describe that. Or I could use, a totally generic thing like application JSON and apply a Hydra annotation to it, which says this particular thing is for adding a print queue. There are lots of ways to describe this that are machine readable.
Okay, so if I can interpret that and bring us back to the original point, is that you're saying that there's no harm in bringing the ability to describe actions into the message itself.
Yeah, I would say that's true. Yeah.
Okay.
And you might
whether it's there implicitly or whether it's there explicitly,
right.
it doesn't actually do any harm. Okay, fair enough. So because I was sort of seeing it as redundant, but you're saying it's not redundant. It's just an alternative way of describing the action.
Or it's actually moving things around, right?
Yeah.
Because you brought up sort of the notion that no matter whether you use a JSON message with Hydra or you use a specific message design or you use HTML or you just use plain source code, that there's no message needed at all. You're really doing the same thing, and you still need code for every single one of those stories, right?
Yes.
Magically putting it in a specific media type doesn't make it post to the queue, right? There's got to be code that executes. So really, the talk then is, well, what's in each one of those code sets? And I think you started to talk about it, like it becomes more and more abstract, right? So in the simplest example, I don't need a message to tell me what to do. I already know ahead of time. I know the address, I know the arguments, I know what it means, right?
Yep.
In the next version, I might have a very specific media type, and I write code that says, hey, it's time to print to the queue. Go find the print queue object in the message and use the details there. And then there's another one, which is, it's time to print to a queue. I've got an HTML message, looks for the class that says, and, it just gets more and more abstract, right?
Yep.
So,
agreed.
So that's actually the thinking behind this notion of profile. Profile is just another way to start doing this. Whether it's better, whether it's worse, depends a lot on your long-term goal, your short-term goal, the tools, the community. There's a lot of stuff involved. But I think one of the things that Leonard and I really wanted to emphasize was this notion that let's think specifically about the way we translate human-readable documentation into machine-readable stuff. And that's really what sort of got us started on this particular line, I think, is the notion that, you know, how do we do that today? How do we want to do that? What are the other possibilities? And that's really what that was about.
Okay. Let's talk about benefits of the profile from different perspectives of either the consumer of an API versus the producer. Because I'm more sold on the benefits on the producer side. Because I think there is, when you come to define a media type, and if you try and define both structural and protocol and application semantics within a media type, it's obviously a more complex document. If you can split it out and use some standardized mechanism as like a profile description language, then you are traveling a more traveled path and less likely to fall into pitfalls that you haven't seen before, right? There's some complexity introduced by using that profile description language, because obviously that profile description language has to be flexible enough to handle most application domain problems. The question is the payoff of traveling the well-traveled path worth it over the additional complexity of having a solution that solves everybody's problem? So that's on the server side. So let's kind of dig into that a little bit more. Do you think that we're not going to get into a really complex description language, meta description language, with the profile description language? Do you think there's enough value there without adding additional complexity?
Well, so I'll tell you what Leonard and I mentioned Leonard a couple of times. Leonard's been involved in the project. Mark Foster's also been is also a signature on the ALPS design. I can tell you we're trying to keep that profile description really, really simple, and it's hard.
Yeah,
it's really hard. So one of the things we didn't talk about is sort of the difference between profile description and discovery formats. They're really three very different cases, right? So
okay, you're gonna have to explain that to me. What?
Oh, yeah. So description formats are like WSDL and Waddle and RAML and Swagger.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They're very, very descriptive of the service.
Mm-hmm.
Like we have these endpoints and we have these arguments and it returns these objects and it'll return 200, 300, 400. I mean, they're very descriptive. That's not a profile, right? A profile is sort of a brief. These things, I mean, from WSDL, I can press a button, generate code, both on client and server side. That's incredibly powerful. So the attempt that we're doing with ALPS is nowhere near that. Nowhere near that. Mark's been using it to generate some stuff at runtime. I think he could talk about what he's doing. I don't really know. Then you also have sort of the discovery patterns, like Adam's service or Mark Nottingham's JSON Home or Google's. I think they just call it discovery. They have like a discovery doc, which is kind of a config file. Though that's sort of a different class. That's sort of meant to be at runtime. I could go out and find something. Like a new version of his Kin Lane's APIs.json pattern, right? I think Kin and Steve Wilmot from 3Scale are trying to do some stuff like that. They're describing stuff that you could kind of look up, right? So that, again, is not what we think profiling does, right? So, going back to your question, is it going to pay off? Geez, I really don't know. So one of the challenges, I think, is do people even really want to think about this profile separately from the discovery and the description? Even more to the point, one of the challenges that we're putting out with ALPS, for example, is do they want to think about the profile independent of format and protocol? right? So that's one of the challenges of ALPS. In ALPS, we say you can pick a protocol, you can pick a format, you can pick a profile, you kind of mix it in a bucket. That's really challenging.
Is it fair to say that ALPS focuses purely on describing the payload as opposed to any interactions in the API?
No. I would say actually what ALPS is very, very close to Eric Evans' bounded context. Right? ALPS is describing that interface a layer that's shared by all parties without describing how it works, without describing what the objects are, without describing the details hidden behind that interface. You have 42 properties, you have 15 actions, that's how you do accounting, right? That's kind of what ALPS is trying to do. And that's very different than all the other ones, right? So it says we have 15 different transitions. This is how you find a list of accounts, this is how you post to account, this is how you do a credit to account or a debit to account, this is how you get a statement, so on and so forth. And that's all it says. And then it says there are 50 properties you ought to know.
Okay, so let me refine my wording.
Yeah.
It does describe information in payloads, right? I'm right that far, right?
Yeah. It helps you identify them. Yeah, right.
So then it also describes state transitions.
Yeah.
Within that model, information model.
Yeah.
But it does it in a protocol-independent way.
Yeah, I would say that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the way that we've talked about it is that it says, in the domain of X, accounting, you could be successful if you understand these 40 properties and these 15 transitions. It doesn't say these 15 transitions must be here. It doesn't say all 40 properties must be used.
Yep. Yep.
But it does say if you understand these two things, you could build something. Is kind of what it's meant to do. Now
going back to the exercise that we did at RESTfest 3 years ago, I think it was, where it was a micro formats where the ALPS description basically gave classes that you could annotate XHTML with.
Yep, it was totally based on Tantic Celik's XHTML idea, right?
Right, and we had reasonable amount of success taking developers working on multiple different platforms, all working against this written prose spec.
Mm-hmm.
What has it been that has led you to take that a step further from being just a written spec to try and be a machine-readable description?
Well, so the first thing is the written spec was how to understand the meanings of each of these things, right?
Yes.
The written spec said the class marked something means this, right?
Yep.
In ALPS, what we've done is we've said, here's how you communicate the something part, and here's how you map it to HTML. All right, so what we've done is we've stepped a further back. We've really taken the same principles and tried to make it so that it's not tied to a single media type. And that's really the only difference. Okay. So the ALP spec doesn't describe microblogging anymore. ALP spec describes how you describe microblogging. It's a definite abstract.
Yes.
And the reason we did it was to see if we can apply it to more than one protocol, more than one media type.
Okay. And as a machine readable format, do you see that format that machine description being used at design time, at runtime, on the client, on the server? Where do you see that machine readable description being used?
So we think it can be used in lots of places. It certainly can be used at design time. So one of the things, a very minor experiment, it's a very, very early stages, Ronnie Mitra, who's one of my API Academy buddies, is working on a designer, like a visual designer for designing services.
Okay.
And one of the things that it inputs is an ALPS document. So once it inputs an ALPS document, it actually tells the designer, the human, these are the properties you can work with, these are the transitions you can work with. Go ahead and arrange your resources, and say this resource is going to return these properties in a list. This resource has this transition in it. And it makes sure that when you design this, you design it based on that domain, which sort of guarantees that anybody else who knows that domain is going to be able to use it. So that's a design time use of ALPS.
Yep.
One of the other possibilities is actually a runtime use of ALPS. I posted to one of my GitHubs using an ALPS document at runtime, an ALPS JSON document at runtime, to turn a local domain object into a representation. So what you do is you read an ALPS document, you write some mapping between ALPS and your object model, and then that generates JSON, application JSON or collection JSON or HAL JSON or something like that. In other words, it's used at runtime in the code, like it's built in. It's not like it magically sort of discovers it. It's actually built in to do the mapping translations, right? So it becomes the driver for live mapping of object domain to representative. Now the third option, which we think is possible, but I don't know this is really happening, Mark may be doing it, that is that I'm a client that's built to understand accounting. And I'm in desperate need of finding an accounting service out there somewhere. So I bot around, I actually search for somebody who has, they say they support the ALPS accounting spec. And I'm like, oh, magic. And then I start talking to that service, right? So that's actually sort of the, using it as discovery and runtime binding. It's like, oh, you speak HTML, it's going one step further. You speak HTML and in the accounting domain, I win. But I don't know that anybody's done that.
Yeah.
There's some other things you can use it for, but I think those are the three.
Yeah. To go back to your last example where you were mapping from your domain objects to what you call representer and I call domain object or DOM. It
right?
kind of, or what, and what a lot of people will call DTOs or view models, right?
Yeah, you can think of it as a view model, definitely.
Yeah. So could I, if you're familiar in the .NET world, there's a very popular tool called AutoMapper. You could sort of see the ALPS document as a structural description of what AutoMapper needs to do in order to convert the domain objects into a representational object.
Okay, I don't know AutoMapper, but I believe you because you know this space well.
Yeah, it usually you write lines of code or there's certain automatic capabilities for being able to map data out of domain objects into DTOs. So, okay, I get that. I understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take this a little further to the boundary, right? Yeah. Where you're returning some kind of what you tend to use the term format, right? Be it HAL or collection plus JSON or Siren or Mason. One of these, what I tend to call generic media types. Sorry, I'll cancel collection plus JSON out of that list of media types. To me that solves a very specific problem. But
yes.
So we're now returning that media type, and we're also adding some kind of annotation to say that media type also contains information that complies with this profile. Can we just cover briefly the different ways that we can annotate our message formats with the profile? What are the mechanically? How do we do that?
Sure. So Eric's Vild's RFC spec says one of the ways you can do it is with a link header. Right. So I can have a link header that's some address, some URI, semicolon rel equals profile. So that URI can actually be just an identifier, sort of like in the RDF sense. It's like a unique identifier, and it doesn't need to be dereferenced. It's just like, oh, that says it's in the accounting namespace, so it's accounting. Sort of like what we do with XSDs and stuff like that, and namespaces in XML. Or it could actually point to a real live document, like an ALPS document or something like that. So link header is one of them.
Yep.
Collection JSON actually says that you can also use it in the top link set. So you could have a rel link profile. You could do a link in HTML, like a link header in HTML. Basically, even though they've lost the profile attribute, you could use just a link, in the head section. I'm sure HAL, would let you do the same thing. Uber, you can do that same thing.
HAL
so
actually explicitly.
So you can put it in the message or in the header in HTTP, and then I think if you went into things like XMPP or WebSockets, it would have to be in the message somewhere.
I've also seen people talking about putting it as a parameter on the media type. How do you feel about that?
Oh, yeah, you can definitely do that. As a matter of fact, that might actually be a proposed thing for collection JSON. I'm not a fan of it, but
Okay.
you can definitely do that. I prefer the sort of the link rel examples, but you can do that. The challenge from just a purely technical standpoint is it's technically illegal to put arbitrary arguments on a media type string that's not in the spec.
Yes.
For instance, the collection JSON spec has a proposed edit to change the registration so that it includes this profile, and it doesn't technically have it yet. But yeah, you can definitely do that.
Okay, so how about being able to put multiple profiles in a single representation?
Yeah.
Because I mean, we do that with namespaces, right?
Yes, we do it with namespaces, and I can tell you it's a contention point in the Alps gang, and I say it's legal. But for me personally, it falls under the category of just because you can doesn't mean you should. It really, okay. It's a mathematical, it's a Cartesian explosion, right? If I start doing multiple ones, I think Mark's brought up a couple things. Maybe it was Irakli too, that you can end up with collisions if you start to combine strings. So I think in practice it's sort of a bad deal, but in Alps we don't prevent it.
Right.
And we do it in namespaces.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So we have multiple namespaces.
Yeah, and I think there's wisdom in that kind of guidance where we're not saying you can't do it. We just suggest that you don't do it because there may become a point at one point where it's like, oh, well, we really do need to do it in this particular case. So
yeah, exactly right. Or the other thing that Leonard has pointed this out several times is a lot of times what you have to do is you have to let the community sort of decide, and rather than constrain people from trying things, let them decide. And as long as they're not running in traffic, as long as they're not drilling a hole in the bottom of the boat, people will wise up and say, well, I'm not using that service. Mike's service has got like 6 profiles on it. I'm not doing that. I'm going over to Darrel's, which is a much simpler service. And that you have that sort of 1,000 flowers bloom kind of pattern.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I remember watching one of Irakli's presentations, and he used the phrases the open world assumptions and closed world assumptions.
Yeah.
And that whole open world where it's like, we're just going to tell you this, and as long as this is true, then you should be fine. Like, let's not try and specify every single aspect and lock everything down.
Yeah, over-constraining is a bummer. Yeah.
So, profile, okay, so we're recommending we only use a single profile. There is, in the number of conversations that I've had, one of the benefits that's kind of been told to me is, well, if you provide a message format and you also separate out the profile into application semantics, then if somebody doesn't understand the application semantics, they can still consume it in using the message format if they do understand the message format. Now, I've argued that that's kind of, yeah, you can do that, but you can't really do anything useful with it because if the application semantics are the things that actually tell you what you are able to do. I see this a lot with people who argue, well, I don't want to create a specific media type for something because then the browser won't render the JSON properly. I have to return it as application/JSON or Google won't render it properly. And I kind of feel that that's a bit of a red herring. Have you seen really useful examples where a client can downgrade and just understand the message format, not understand the actual application semantics, but still do something useful with the response?
Well, so here's the way I look at it. First of all, what you describe is actually, I think, and Marcus is not here to defend himself, but I think it's actually an idea behind Marcus's JSON LD and Hydra. In other words, not that you can downgrade, but that you can ignore, right? So that if I understand, if I've read the documentation, and I've written a specific client to know what objects are coming back and what the meaning of those objects are, if I've built that into my source code, I can ignore the profile header. As a matter of fact, that's what we do all the time. Everybody who writes an application JSON client bakes all of the semantic knowledge into the source code. Adding a profile header doesn't change it. Right? So we have people ignoring that all the time.
Yeah, but that's not necessarily, just because people do it doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing, right?
The question is, can I come up with examples of it? Yes, because we do. Right?
Okay, can you come up with valuable examples of it?
Well, I mean, that's how we build applications today, right? We bake semantics into the client, not the message. That's really what we do. And that's why HTML is so popular, because HTML is like falling into the category, I think you call it sort of like the meaningless formats, right? There's no meaning in there, right? I assumed you didn't mean that in a derogatory sense. I was like,
no, that's right. It was just when you say it makes it sound like I said it in a mean way.
But right, I mean, that was sort of what part of your message was, right?
Yeah. Yep.
XML plain, JSON plain, HTML plain, and even some of these other sort of formats, they don't have the meaning built in. And that's a challenge, right? So that means you build it into the code. So we do this all the time now. So the real question is, can I write a client that can consume a message marked with a profile, even when I don't understand the profile? And the answer is yes. Is it a good idea? People do it all the time now. It's basically how we write apps today. Right? It's how we write apps today. So we read it readable, bake it into code, consume the message.
Right, but it's how we write apps today and how we generate coupling, which causes us to have to version, and why we keep having versioning debates, right? That the idea of the message being self-descriptive is so that we don't do implicit out-of-band coupling on those messages, and so that we don't have to run into major versioning issues further down the road. So.
Yeah, I think for the most part that's true, but I mean, I can create a message format that creates high coupling, right? I can create a very specific message format that creates very high coupling.
Yes.
And as soon as I make a change to it, I break all the clients, right?
Right, but the point being that the client is aware that the message has changed.
Yeah.
If it's self-descriptive.
Yeah. I mean, I can change it in a way that breaks clients right away, right? There's no guarantees there. There's a goal there, though, right? One of the cool things about HTML is that there's a client for HTML that the contract isn't at the semantic level, it's at the message level.
Yes.
If I move the form from here to here, it doesn't break.
Well, HTML semantics are completely understood by the browser.
Exactly. And those semantics
we embed a whole bunch of extra semantics.
Right. Now you're getting there, right? So the semantics that it's understanding have nothing to do with where the P is placed, or where the form is placed, or where the link shows up, right? When I move the link or I move the form, it doesn't break, because the agreement is at a different level, right? The agreement isn't that when you use this URL, you're going to get a P with a specific class returned. It's that you're going to get a document returned.
Yes.
Right? Most of us don't write clients like that. We say, when I do this URL, I'm going to get this property in this location, in this part of the hierarchy, all the time in that place. And if I move it, I'm screwed.
Right, but would it not be fair to argue that's one of the behaviors that people like you and myself are trying to discourage people from creating that explicit coupling?
Yeah, exactly. But I'm just saying, it isn't the format that's causing that error, right? So much the way we write clients. We write clients that want some kind of guarantees that are way beyond what browser guarantees want.
Now, to kind of put a hole in my own argument, I suppose with more sophisticated hypermedia formats and standardized link relations, I could see clients being able to do limited things with documents that they don't understand the application semantics. And I'm thinking of things like indexing, searching. I've always sort of envisioned it purely in the debugging style, but when you start thinking of more generalized operations like storage, archival, indexing, searching, I can imagine the ability to be able to treat, for example, JSON LD documents in a completely generic way without really caring exactly what the content is, because we're just going to textually index that anyway. So I suppose in just verbalizing it, I am able to sort of envision scenarios where it might make sense.
Yeah. So just to follow that for just a second, you know this idea of Shannon messaging or Wiener-Shannon theory about message integrity?
No.
So during the end of the Second World War, we were starting to use electronics to send messages, coded messages back and forth, right? So there's this danger, like how do I know that the message I sent is the message that gets received? Hasn't been interrupted or noise hasn't screwed it up in some way. So Wiener and Shannon invented a way to guarantee that the message integrity is the same, that it got from A to B and it hasn't been changed. And the first version of that was a parity bit. Like I'm going to send the message and a parity bit, check it. Oh, messages has message integrity. So because of Wiener and Shannon, we have things like encoding schemes, encryption, and all these other things, because we can create a message that we don't understand, ship it, and validate that it's a message that was shipped, even though we don't understand it. We can operate on it even though we don't understand what's inside, right? He applied this to telephone calls to make sure that you didn't get noise and all these other things. There's a lot of cool stuff in that space. And in a way, that's kind of what we just talked about. Are there things I can do on the message without understanding what's in it? I could index it. I can index all the words in it. I don't know what it's talking about, but I can index all the words in it. So there are definitely sort of Shannon-level activities that we can do with messages. In some ways, what we're trying to do with ALPS is increase the Shannon level of messages. In other words, by separating those pieces out, people can do things with different parts of it. So I think there are some really valuable things there. But I think there's another thing that you're probably going to get to, but we haven't talked about, and that is, one of the things that we're doing with ALPS is, and I talk about this a lot, is separating out, separating the protocol, separating the structure, separating the domain semantics into separate buckets. There are a lot of successful media types that don't do that. They bag it all into one. You mentioned them specifically in your blog post, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's important for us to talk about that.
Yeah.
You want to start that?
Yeah, so I mean, and this is one of the things that I've been pushing, because my interest is in the defining of application semantics within a media type in a way that can be reusable. The idea that we can create a certain set of semantics that we can communicate to the client, that the client can actually act on, and that we can start building reusable code on the client to take advantage of those semantics. And I mean, the examples I gave in the blog post were things like the voice XML and call control XML, which are kind of industry specific, but they're not API specific. It's not one particular company that's come along and said, this is the type we're going to use for our API. It was a industry standard definition that allows interoperability. And I think spot when you recognize that you can have multiple clients that are capable of talking to multiple servers, all using shared messages. That like RSS and Atom was a classic example. I could choose my favorite feed reader, and I could point to people's blogs all over the place. Like that's where I want a lot more of the people who are building distributed business applications, distributed anything applications, to try and move towards. But in order to do that, you have to focus on application semantics and get the right granularity of application semantics. Some of the ones that I've kind of promoted and have been trying to use are things like HTTP problem, because how many times have the APIs defined their own definition for how to return a payload that describes an error that's occurred in an API? HTTP problem, and well, also VND error, which is another one from one of our ResFest alumni, do this job very nicely. You don't need to invent your own anymore. Jason Home that you mentioned before from Mark Nottingham is another one. It's discovery formal APIs. Now, not many people have yet been writing client code that consumes those in a reasonable. We're still very early on in getting that kind of adoption. But hopefully, and that's kind of what I've been pushing. And one of my sort of objections, and I aired this a little bit at the last ResFest, is we're spending a lot of effort in this meta profile world and not spending enough time talking about app semantics. And I think this conversation has kind of helped me realize, yeah, okay, they're both valuable, right?
Yeah, and they can be, but so I think, we mentioned this before we started today. I love that you brought up voice XML and call control XML. I used to do a bunch of work for Dialogic, and that really, working in those two languages, kind of blew my mind in the sense of like, oh, this is not HTML. Like, oh, there's a connection, but the connection is in design and domain, right?
Yes.
So I love the story of voice XML because it really is just the way you describe it. It's a vertical. It's an industry. So people who do call servers, people who create handsets like, that sit on top of a desktop, people who write documents and automated call attendancy, they all use the exact same domain and they all use the exact same language to work together, which was incredible. And it really sort of optimized that industry and created a huge business model that still exists today. I still have customers today that I work with that use voice and call control XML. Now, it's XML, it's old, but that's fine. It's like more than 10 years, right?
Yeah.
So I love that idea. And I love the idea. I wish we had vertical languages. I keep using it. We should have an accounting language. It should be, a domain, and it covers that space. We could do lots of things. I remember specifically talking to, I want to say it's the OpenStack group, a couple of years ago when there was this Sturm und Drang about, Amazon's way of doing it and OpenStack's way of doing it, and they were going to like create this generic API, and I said, let's do a language. Let's do a language, and that lets everybody sort of do their specifics in that domain. But we're all going to talk the same language. Now, could not get any traction. Recently talked to a man who supported me, like it was about a year and a half ago, on the payment space.
Yeah.
There's another payment space would be a great language that we could do. There just doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in that, and it's really frustrating because I think telcos go through this like every once in a while. There's some big initiative, there's some consortium of generic APIs, and it falls over. But I think we could do a language like voice or call, or there are a couple of other ones that are sort of escaping me at the moment. I really love that space. What Leonard and I ran into was just this lack of interest. Like, no, we're not interested in designing a new format for a vertical. And that's really what got us to thinking, well, then, how do we communicate this information over formats that are not domain specific? And that's this notion of profile. Now, the deal is, if I'm an individual, it's going to be hard for me to gain traction in a vertical space, especially if the space is small. So I'm probably going to use a generic format, and it would be nice if I could annotate it. But if I'm part of a huge industry, we could get together and we could design a specific language, a domain-specific language, and we could slay lots of dragons with relative simplicity, right?
Okay, but I think you've gone from one vertical extreme to the other really generic. I think there's kind of the middle place. And one of my favorite ones is whenever I go to conferences and you have all the vendor booths and they're all selling tools and stuff. There's always somebody selling charting and graphing libraries. Right? Mm-hmm. And what does every charting and graphing library implement? The ability to take some flat file, CSV, or Excel table of data, bring it down and suck it into their library, and they do their best guessing to figure out, well, what's time series data and what should go on the x-axis and what should go on the y-axis, and all of the semantics of how can they either, you have to enter it explicitly through some kind of configuration in the toolkit, or they try and infer it, or there's some kind of configuration that's specific to that tooling. If instead there were a language, as you describe it, for describing data points for statistical analysis, then all of a sudden APIs could start exporting that data in that language, and then any toolkit, graphing toolkit, should be able to consume that. So
Yeah.
there, it's a vertical domain insofar as we're trying to solve the problem of graphs and charts, right? But it's not vertical we're not in telecom or healthcare or manufacturing, right?
I'm totally cool with that. I think what you described was SVG, right? Or did I sort of miss it?
Well, SVG is somewhat more generic than no. I mean,
no, I'm with you. I'm just poking you, but yeah, I'm totally cool with that. If we can get people to agree, this goes to you know, the McElroy's idea about the way Unix systems would work, right? Is you do one thing well, and he said use pipes, he said use text to communicate back and forth. But if you have an agreement, it's like, look, I can output this in the graphing language, like in the graphing data format, right? I can do this. Then all of a sudden, lots of tools can output it, and lots of tools can consume it, and you can create a marketplace. I am totally cool with that. Yeah, I use sort of the the high and low version, but I know exactly where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Now, I think one of the worries that I have, but it's a worry. It's like like an emotional worry. It has nothing to do with facts. One of the worries is that as a client developer, in order for me to start using a service, I probably got to buy into 6 or 7 of these like dialogues, right?
Languages,
I'm going to have to buy into V&D error. I'm going to have to buy into V&D home, or JSON home. I'm going to have to buy into the accounting one and the graphing one before I can talk to this service.
Yes.
So that kind of worries me about the bar, but like I said, it's a worry. Right now I have to buy in anyway, right? Because I read documentation, I write a custom client that doesn't work with anybody but you anyway.
Right. But so the thing is at the moment when we go to consume an API, we tend to go and download the client library provided by the API provider, right? In order to talk to their API.
Right.
So this just changes the boundaries of those libraries. Instead of it being a library that is specific to an API that I want to consume, now it's a library related to the language that I want to consume, and I may do that from one API, or I may do it from 5 APIs, right?
Right, and it's a set of languages, right?
Yes.
I mean, so totally meta to the rest of this, right? Whether you want to advocate for just using the generic sets, and using generic and media profiles, or using specifics. One of the things that I want to do is lower the barrier of entry. One of the things that has worried me over the last 10 years is the barrier of entry for using a service has gone up and up and up and up. I have to write more specific code. I'm basically doing bespoke apps for almost every API I work with. And that's really sort of counter to Berners-Lee's idea about the idea that you could just point a generic client at a thing and it magically works. That was his sort of idea in the late 80s, early 90s. We've gotten pretty far from that, right? So as long as we can continue to lower the bar, I forget who it was who told me this. They said, if you design a media type, you should be required to actually build a client.
Yeah.
So sort of using your model about JSON home and all, you should probably be required to build a library, so that maybe now I look at the documentation and it says we use JSON home and we use V&D error and we use accounting and Maze XML, and here's the list of libraries for language of your choice. It's all open source, by the way. You don't see the language of your choice, build one.
Yeah, that's right.
And so you go grab, and now you're sort of just gluing things together rather than writing tedious code, right? Right?
I'm completely in agreement with you.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the way we both think we want to be heading, right? And I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we just approached it from slightly different angles, but I'm definitely seeing that our longer term vision is closer to what I had previously perceived. So that was definitely one of my objectives for this conversation.
Cool.
And we're coming up to the hour, so if you have any closing comments, then go for it, and we'll wrap this up.
The only thing the only closing comment I have is this idea of making it easier for developers, creating a better developer experience for building something, lowering the barrier of entry, increasing the tractability, increasing sort of the dependability, whether it's through specific designs or applications of semantics against the general design. I really think we need a lot more of that. As we get more and more devices, more and more things, I think rewriting code over and over as small changes happen is going to be less and less affordable, both in time and money. So anything we can do to make it possible, to make it easier to build and easier to maintain, I'm for. And I think this is an area that this is a way that we can reach that, I think. That's me.
Excellent stuff. Well, thank you very much, Mike. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah,
we should find another topic, and we should do this again sometime soon.
We should definitely do this again. I'd love to hear feedback from others on this. You know, I guess you have a Google page now, right, for this? Is that the way?
Yeah. Well, this will now is out on YouTube. It's broadcasting currently on YouTube, so there will be a YouTube page that has the recording of it. So we'll be able to share that on Twitter. And yes, definitely, we'd love to hear comments as to any other topics that you'd like us to debate hotly, or anything that you think needs a lot more explaining in this industry.
All right, man. I love it. Thanks for setting this up. Say hi to John too for me.
Activity right at the end. Okay, will do. Take care.